In October 2024, a regular check of a Victorian-era photograph would lead to one of the most shocking finds in the study of women's history in 19th-century America. What started as a normal cataloging job at a Boston auction house became a probe that would last 4 months, cross 3 states, and finally show a forgotten web of bravery that had stayed hidden in plain sight for over 137 years. The photograph in question had lived more than a century tucked away in the attic of an old textile mill owner's mansion in Lowell, Massachusetts. When the estate was finally sold after years of legal fights, its items were split among various auction houses and antique dealers throughout New England. Among hundreds of items was a single framed family portrait dated 1887. At first look, it seemed fully normal. 7 people posed in formal Victorian clothes, their faces serious and calm as was common for the era. Dr. Emily Richardson, a curator at the Massachusetts Historical Society who focused on 19th-century social records, had seen thousands of similar photographs during her 15-year career. Studio portraits from the 1880s followed strict rules, set poses, careful placement of family members by rank, and firm formality. On that rainy afternoon, as she processed items for an upcoming show, Richardson almost logged the photograph without a second look, but something made her stop. Perhaps it was the odd placing of one woman's hand, or the way the light hit a certain detail. Richardson got her magnifying glass and leaned closer. What she saw made her heart pound. The woman seated to the left, seeming to be in her mid-30s with dark hair and a high-collared dress, had placed her left hand in a way that seemed odd, almost not natural for a formal portrait. The hand rested on her lap, but 3 fingers were spread in a clear setup, while the thumb and index finger touched at the tips, forming what looked like a planned symbol. Richardson's breath stopped. In all her years studying Victorian photography, she had never seen such a pose caught in a formal family portrait. These photographs were carefully planned events, costly and rare, where every part was managed and meant. Random hand spots simply did not happen. If this pose was in the photograph, it was there for a reason. Planned talk, frozen in time, waiting for someone to note. Dr. Richardson spent the rest of that afternoon noting every detail of the photograph. Accidents were common, illness was widespread, and those who griped about conditions risked instant firing. But Eleanor Parker's name did not show in the millwork records. Instead, Richardson found something far more gripping. Eleanor was listed in the records of St. Anne's Episcopal Church as a visiting nurse who gave care to workers' families. This role would have given Eleanor access to many homes, close knowledge of families in crisis, and a level of trust and freedom odd for a woman of her time. The parts were starting to form a shape, but Richardson still did not grasp the hand pose's meaning. Richardson's big break came from an odd source. While looking into Victorian-era women's groups and aid societies, she found a mention in a scholarly piece about women's reform moves in factory cities. The piece, published in 1998, noted in passing that some women's aid societies in the 1880s had made quiet signaling ways to spot safe houses and trusted people without drawing notice from hostile officials or harsh family members. The piece cited a set of personal letters kept at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University. Richardson right away called the library and set up to study the set. 3 days later, she sat in the cool reading room, carefully turning the weak pages of letters between women involved in what they called protective work, efforts to help women and kids flee bad home settings and harsh work conditions. One letter dated March 1886 and written by a woman named Harriet from Lawrence, Massachusetts, held a rough sketch in the margin, and the drawing showed a hand with 3 fingers spread and the thumb and index finger touching, exactly matching the pose in Eleanor Parker's photograph. Below the sketch, Harriet had written, "Remember our sign, 3 for the trinity of safety, shelter, food, and secrecy. The circle means our web is whole. Show this to any woman in need, and she will know you are a friend." Richardson sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was not just a random hand spot or a photo quirk. Eleanor Parker had on purpose put a coded message in her family portrait, a message that named her as part of an underground web set on helping weak women and kids. The fact that she had managed to add this sign into a formal family photograph taken in a pro studio with her brother-in-law paying for the sitting was both bold and smart. But why risk showing herself in such a fixed way? Family portraits were costly, prized items that would be shown plainly in homes and may be seen by anyone who came by. By 1880, Eleanor was making regular trips to tenements and boarding houses throughout Lowell's Mill District. Richardson found mentions of Eleanor in church meeting notes and local paper stories from the 1880s. She was called devoted to aid work among the worthy poor and praised for her Christian aid to sick families, and matching with other papers. Richardson began to grasp that these public acts served as cover for more bold work, helping women and kids flee harsh homes and harsh bosses. Eleanor's work as a visiting nurse gave the perfect cover. In the 1880s, these nurses went into working-class areas, migrant tenements, and mill workers' boarding houses, giving basic medical care to families who could not pay for doctors. This gave Eleanor access to the weakest groups in Lowell, families struggling with illness, injury, job loss, and the daily pains of factory life. She saw firsthand the toll that 12-hour workdays in risky mills took on women's bodies. She saw kids working in mills when they should have been in school. She met women trapped in marriages where physical force was seen as a private matter beyond legal help. Richardson found that Eleanor's nursing trips often lasted longer than medical need would call for, and she often went back to the same homes many times. These patterns hinted at something more than normal health care. She was building bonds, making trust, and quietly giving aid to women who badly needed help but had nowhere else to turn. Armed with Eleanor Parker's name and the knowledge of the coded hand pose, Richardson widened her probe beyond Lowell, and she called archives, historical societies, and college libraries throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, asking for hunts for similar photographs from the 1880s and 1890s that might hold the same pose or forms of it. The replies began coming within weeks, and they were striking. A small museum in Providence had a cabinet card photograph from 1889 showing 3 women at a church event, one of them showing the same 3-finger pose, though more subtly placed. The New Hampshire Historical Society found a family portrait from 1891 where an older woman's hand formed a like setup. The American Textile History Museum in Lowell had an image from 1888 of workers outside a mill, and when Richardson studied it closely, she spotted 2 women in the back row with their hands placed in the known pattern. Each find led to more queries and more study. Richardson began making a list of these women, tracking their names, spots, jobs, and family links. A pattern came out that was both gripping and sad. Nearly all of the women were linked in some way to factory work as seamstresses, mill workers, home helpers, or laundresses. Many were unmarried, widowed, or like Eleanor, split from their husbands. They lived in cities and towns throughout New England where textile making and linked trades hired large numbers of working-class women and kids. And Richardson found mentions of these women in odd places. Church meeting notes now and then said they gave Christian aid to sick families. Local paper stories from the 1880s and 1890s sometimes noted their part in temperance groups or moral reform bodies. Okay, public faces for women's activism, but the proof hinted these public acts served as cover for more bold work. What made Eleanor Parker's web special was its skill and secrecy. Unlike more public reform groups, this web ran mostly unseen using coded signs, trusted go-betweens, and careful care to avoid drawing hostile notice. The hand pose and photographs served many uses. It named members of the web to each other. It logged their pledge for future kin, and it gave a fixed record that could not be easily ruined or denied, like letters or spoken proof. Richardson found proof that the web kept several safe houses in Lowell alone, modest homes and flats where women and kids could stay for a while plans were made for more lasting fixes. These spots changed often to avoid catching, and they were backed through small gifts, free work, and the personal funds of women who gave themselves to this work. As Richardson's probe deepened, she began to grasp the clever ways Eleanor and her web used to run under the watchful eyes of a society that would have damned their work. In part was how they hid their acts within fully decent Victorian social setups, church groups, sewing circles, aid societies that no one would doubt or check too closely. Eleanor's spot within the home was itself a form of guard. As an unmarried woman living with her sister's family, she was expected to add to the home through housework and was under her brother-in-law's rule. But Thomas Harrison, Richardson found through business records and personal letters, was a forward-thinking trader who backed temperance reform and believed in growing school chances for working-class kids. While there was no direct proof he knew the full scope of Eleanor's acts, he clearly gave her much freedom to follow her nursing work and aid tasks. The timing of the 1887 family portrait was especially key. Richardson found that it was taken just 3 months after a major tragedy in Lowell, a fire at one of the textile mills that killed 7 workers, including 3 young women. The disaster had sparked public cry and calls for better safety rules, but nothing big had changed. In the wake, Eleanor and other women in her web had ramped up their efforts, helping families of the dead and aiding workers who wanted to leave the mills for safer jobs. The photograph Richardson grasped was Eleanor's quiet act of fight and logging, unable to speak openly about her work, unable to push openly for the women she helped. Eleanor had found a way to leave a fixed record of her pledge. The hand pose was her mark, her proof, frozen in a moment that would outlast her by more than a century. Richardson found that several other women in Eleanor's web had done something like it, adding the coded pose into family photographs, wedding portraits, even funeral cards. Anne later wed, had kids, and lived to age 73, a long life by the norms of mill workers, many of whom died young from mishaps, illness, or weariness. Another kin shared letters that noted a safe house on Adams Street in Lowell where women could stay when woes at home became too much. The letters never fully told what happened at this house, but they noted Eleanor by name and praised her care and kindness. Richardson found the spot and found that it had been owned by a widow named Mrs. Whitman, who rented rooms on the face to boarders, but who, by city records, never seemed to have steady long-term renters. These personal tales showed the real side of Eleanor's work. Women and kids who came to her were given instant shelter, basic needs, and then aid in finding longer-term fixes, new jobs, homes in other cities, sometimes even help with legal steps in cases of grave abuse. The web ran on trust, care, and the will of dozens of women to add what they could. And Richardson's probe also found the personal costs Eleanor and other web members paid for their acts. Victorian society had firm hopes for women, mostly unmarried women who leaned on family aid. Fighting those hopes, even for good reasons, bore real risks. In 1892, 5 years after the family portrait was taken, Eleanor Parker's name showed in Lowell court records in a grim setting. A man named Robert had sued Eleanor for butting into home affairs after she had helped his wife and 2 kids leave their home and move to Providence. The court papers held Robert's proof, saying that Eleanor had tainted his wife's mind against him and wrecked his family with no cause. Eleanor's proof, logged in the court clerk's neat hand, told a different tale of bruises she had seen during nursing trips, of kids who flinched at loud sounds, of a woman who had told her fear that her husband would one day kill her. The judge had dropped the suit, noting that Eleanor had acted within her role as a visiting nurse worried for her patient's welfare. But the case had been covered in the local paper, and the press had been hurtful. Several church members had doubted whether Eleanor's work was fit for an unmarried woman, and there had been push on Thomas Harrison to use more rule over his sister-in-law's acts. Richardson found proof that the suit and its wake had forced Eleanor to become even more careful. In 1992, her name showed less often in public records and church papers. She seemed to have pulled back from plain aid work, at least on the face, but matching with other sources hinted that her real acts had not dropped. She had simply become better at hiding them. The personal toll was clear in other ways, too. Eleanor never remarried, never had kids of her own, and spent her whole adult life living in her sister's home, leaning on her brother-in-law's kindness. In Victorian America, this would have been seen as a kind of loss, a woman who could not fill her hoped role as wife and mother. But Richardson grasped that Eleanor had made planned picks, giving up normal win and safety to serve a cause she believed in. Other women in the web had faced like tests. Several had been shunned by kin members who frowned on their acts. Some had lost jobs or homes when landlords or bosses found their part in helping women leave marriages or flee harsh work spots. One woman Richardson found through photographs had been briefly jailed in 1894 for keeping a runaway wife, charges that were later dropped, but not before she had spent 3 days in lockup. These were not abstract risks or guess threats. The women in Eleanor's web ran in real legal and social risk every day. Eleanor Parker's final years gave the most touching part of Richardson's probe. After the court case in 1892, Eleanor had gone on with her work, but with more care. By the late 1890s, she was in her mid-40s, and her health had begun to fade. Not odd given the bodily demands of nursing work and the strain of keeping her double life. In 1899, Eleanor's sister Catherine died of lung sickness at age 46. The death paper and church records logged a short illness that moved fast, leaving Thomas Harrison widowed with 3 now-grown kids. Eleanor, as the unmarried sister, naturally stayed in the home to help run house tasks, but Richardson found proof that Catherine's death had a deep effect on Eleanor beyond the personal grief. In Catherine's personal items found during the estate sale that had brought the 1887 photograph to light were several letters Eleanor had written to her sister over the years. These letters, kept with care, showed that Catherine had known about Eleanor's web acts all along and had quietly backed them, sometimes giving financial aid from her home budget, sometimes giving her home as a short refuge when other safe houses were not free, always holding full care to guard both Eleanor and the women they helped. One letter from 1891 was especially telling. Eleanor had written, "Dear sister, I know the risks I take show upon your home and your kids. If Thomas wants me to leave, I will grasp and bear him no ill will, but I cannot leave this work. I have seen too much pain, too many women with nowhere to turn, too many kids trapped in spots not of their making. If I do not help them, who will?" Catherine's reply, written on the back of the same letter, was short but strong. "You will not leave. This is your home and your work is good work. Thomas agrees, though he fears for your safety, as do I. We are proud of you, Eleanor, even if we can never say so in public." This swap gave Richardson a new grasp of the home ties behind the 1887 photograph. The portrait had not just been a log of Eleanor's secret pledge. It had been taken with her family's knowledge and quiet okay. Thomas and Catherine had let Eleanor add her coded pose because they backed what she was doing, even if they could not own it openly. The photograph was both Eleanor's proof and her family's quiet nod to her bravery. Eleanor Parker died in 1904 at age 51. Her death paper listed the cause as wasting disease, tuberculosis, likely caught during her years of nursing work in packed tenements and boarding houses. She was laid to rest in the family plot at Lowell Cemetery, her grave marker bearing a simple note, Eleanor Parker, 1853-1904. She served the herding. In February 2025, 4 months after finding the 1887 photograph, Emily Richardson planned a public talk of her finds at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The event drew more than 200 people. Historians, family tree hunters, kin of Lowell mill workers, and members of the public drawn by the tale of Eleanor Parker and her hidden web. Richardson showed the original photograph plainly along with the dozens of other images she had found holding the coded hand pose. She gave the letters, court papers, and personal tales that showed the reach and effect of the web, and she shared the tales of single women who had been helped. Anne, who fled the mills, the mother and kids who ran to Providence, the many others whose names were lost to history but whose lives had been changed by the bravery and care of women like Eleanor Parker. The talk sparked instant interest beyond the school world. Local papers covered the tale and several national press groups picked it up. Kin of women who had worked in the Lowell mills began coming forward with their own family tales and papers. Some found that their great-great-grandmothers had been part of Eleanor's web or had been helped by it. Others found photographs in family sets that hold the same coded pose, adding to the growing proof of how far this underground web had spread. In the city of Lowell, which had long marked its factory past and the famed mill girls of earlier times, began planning a new show focused on Eleanor Parker and the Women's Guard web. The show would honor not just Eleanor, but all the women, mostly working class, often unseen by history, who had risked their safety and names to help others. Richardson went on with her study, growing it to other factory cities throughout New England and finally beyond. She found proof of webs in Pennsylvania coal towns, New York garment areas, and Midwest factory hubs. The coded hand pose showed in photographs from the 1880s through the early 1900s. Hinting that this form of quiet talk and logging had been more far-reaching than anyone had before known. The 1887 Harrison family portrait, once a forgotten item in an attic, now hung in the lasting set of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Visitors stopped to study Eleanor Parker's on-purpose placed hand, to read about her life and work, and to think what it meant that she had picked to log her pledge in such a fixed public way despite the risks. For Richardson, the probe had become more than a school task. It had shown a hidden part of women's history, a tale of bravery, unity, and quiet fight that tested cozy tales about Victorian manners and women's stillness. Eleanor Parker and the women of her web had not waited for society to shift or for laws to guard them. They had made their own ways of aid and life, running in the shadows, but leaving traces for future kin to find. The photograph's hand pose, once unseen to plain watchers, had at last been seen and known. And in that knowing, Eleanor Parker's proof, frozen in silver and light for 137 years, had at last been heard.